he said, there will be a point in the future where anyone will be able to take a DNA test and we will be able to tell them where they're from. Not just on the country level, not just on a state level even, but we'll be able to tell them like to a village where their family is from. And we're seeing that now, and it's incredible.
Stories That Live in Us is a podcast that inspires you to form deep connections with your family, past, present, and future. I'm Krista Cowan, known online as the Barefoot Genealogist. I've spent my whole life discovering the power of family history, and I know that sharing the stories that live in you can change everything. If you have taken an ancestry DNA test, you know that it tells you a lot about yourself. It gives you information about your origins 500 to 1,000 years ago. It gives you information about the journeys your ancestors have taken within the last 300 years. And then it connects you to thousands of cousins, people who walk around with little bits of DNA that match little bits of your DNA. And all of this 2 decades ago was pretty much unheard of. My guest today is one of my dearest friends. Her name is Diahan Southard. And from the beginning of consumer genomics, she has been on the cutting edge. She now runs a company called Your DNA Guide, where she provides education around genetic genealogy. And she is a brilliant educator and a lovely storyteller and one of my favorite human beings. She not only got into genetics and has been part of that industry from the beginning, but that very scientific exploration and journey brought her to some very personal discoveries. I'm excited for you to hear my conversation with Diahan Southard. Diahan, I'm so glad you're here. You are one of my favorite people, and I'm excited to have this conversation with you, so thank you.
Oh, I'm just pleased to be part of this. I love what you're doing. I love the whole idea of it. You and I have talked about this before. It is one of both of our passions. So I'm grateful I can be a part.
Fabulous. Well, I want to hear, and I think our listeners want to hear about your journey into family history.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because most of the people that I meet that are in genetic genealogy came from genealogy to genetics, and I came from genetics to genealogy. So it was really unexpected for me to end up where I am, but I trace it back to my high school English teacher.
Do tell.
Yes. So he told all of us graduating seniors that the best thing we could do for our lives, our career, our future is to, when we got to college, find a professor who's researching something we were interested in and get involved. So I ended up at Brigham Young University, and I wanted to do something with DNA or, something like that in the field, but there was no actual genetics department. So I went to the microbiology department. And I can picture it now. There's this very nice secretary sitting behind this desk, and I walk up to the desk and I say, can you tell me what are the areas of interest of all the professors? What are they researching? She had a list, which I thought was very prepared of her. Yes. And so I looked down the list, and it's like, virology, bacteria. And I was like, no. And then there was archaeogenetics. I was like, hold up, I don't even really know what that is, but it has the word genetics in it. So I was like, yes, how do I find this professor? And she said, oh, Dr. Scott Woodward, his office is just down the hall. And so I did. I walked down the hall, I knocked on his door and asked if he needed any help with his research.
And there you go.
And there you go. Yeah. So archaeogenetics was, the genetics of ancient remains. So he was involved in a project. There's this huge cemetery outside of Cairo, Egypt, but there was no town. And no one knew who any of these people were. Hundreds of burials. And this was a multidisciplinary study. They had textiles, they had, archaeologists, like all the people were there. And Scott was doing the genetics. And so I jumped in, and we were doing mitochondrial DNA, which traces a direct maternal line. So we were testing all of the bone samples. So we would get tooth samples. So just in case you want to dig up a body, get the teeth, get the femur bone, and there's an occipital bone right in the back. Those are the best sources of DNA, just in case you happen to be digging up your ancestors. So he would bring these samples back to the lab and we would test them. And really his passion was, how can we identify these people? And while we could do a little bit to identify their relationships to each other, we could tell, oh, this is a family. Like there's an adult woman and then there's 2 children and they're both share her mitochondrial DNA. So we could say they're probably a family unit, but there was no way to tell who they were in the world. And so Dr. Woodward started talking about the need for a database. This idea that if we had a database full of people's DNA with their actual family history, we would be able to identify these missing people in Egypt. And so he became kind of an ambassador for this idea of a genetic genealogy database.
And what year was that?
So this is in 1999.
Okay.
Well, 1998, 1999. And then this idea was picked up by a local Utah philanthropist, James Sorensen. And the way that Scott tells the story is that Mr. Sorensen called him at like 2 a.m, okay, and said, I want to build a database of all of the Vikings, because Mr. Sorensen, being a Sorensen, was interested in this Viking research. And so Scott said, well, we could try to do that, and so he pitched him this idea of building a worldwide database and told him how by doing that, we would actually be able to solve Mr. Sorensen's question, which was, how are all the Sorensens related and how, does my family fit in? And so Mr. Sorensen said, yes, let's do that.
and such it was born.
And such it was born, the Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation.
That's amazing. And it's so interesting that it's a Sorensen that did it because Scandinavian names are all patronymic. So you're not going to be related to all the Sorensens, but somehow that was enough to get him interested to be able to make that offer.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So what did you end up majoring in school?
So my major was in microbiology with a minor in chemistry, just because you only had to take 1 more class and you got a minor. But really, my major became genetic genealogy. I just didn't know it. We were pioneers. We were building the first structure, the first ideas, the first database really for genetic genealogy. And so I ended up spending my college weekends traveling all around the country while other kids, I'm assuming, were partying and having fun on their weekends. I was lecturing and collecting blood samples from willing participants, because back then we were taking blood. So I would travel and I would show up at these groups of people, a lot of them in LDS churches, and hundreds of people would come to learn about this technology. And from the very beginning, I was in front of people trying to explain why this was important, why we needed to do it, and why they should give me their blood sample and their 4-generation family tree.
Yeah, I was one of those early participants.
Really? Where did you give yours?
In Orem.
In Orem, Utah.
In Orem, Utah. Yeah. And I remember talking to my family about it too, because even then I knew that they were onto something, and I didn't know what the end goal was, but I knew that my family, my DNA was going to expose information about my family. Oh. And so I had a conversation with my parents and with my grandparents, and I was like, I want to participate in this. I think this is really cool. And I hadn't even gotten into professional genealogy as a career yet, but I had been doing family history long enough that I could see that this was something for sure.
Well, you were one way ahead of your time then, because I doubt anybody thought of that but you. So way to go.
Yeah, it was exciting to imagine the possibilities. And then things move very quickly after that. So you graduated and you joined Sorensen as your career.
Right. So yeah, right. It was perfect timing, as so many things in life are. So I worked for the Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation until I graduated from BYU. And then we were kind of in limbo. I applied for a couple of other jobs, trying to further my career, waiting to see what would happen with Sorensen. And it turns out just at that time, they started to move the foundation out of BYU and into its own kind of private entity up in downtown Salt Lake City, where Sorensen Companies already had a building. And so I was just thrust into this new actual company. And so I helped assemble the lab equipment, and I helped, the office space, like adjusting desks and things, like right literally from the beginning of this company. I found myself in a room with a CEO, a CFO, and a marketing director who had no idea even what DNA was. And I had to try to explain to them what we do so that they could sell it. And it was, looking back, of course, now having my own business, thinking all of that foundational groundwork that was laid for me to understand how a business works and how marketing works and all of the things that have to go into creating all that we did, I was right there learning it all along. And it's really a miracle to look back and think how I had no idea then, but I was learning how to build a company and how to build a product and how to sell that product. And so we became one of the very first direct-to-consumer DNA testing companies.
I love that. And at the time, were they still just doing mitochondrial DNA?
We were doing mitochondrial and Y DNA.
Okay.
And then the actual foundation was still researching how to use autosomal DNA. They were doing lots of testing and projects and lab runs and all the things, trying to work with the database of information we had to try to do what we knew it could do, which is, so the promise that Dr. Woodward gave to all of us when we were just starting out on the project, we were sitting in the basement of the then Benson building on BYU campus, and there was probably, 10 of us there working in the lab, and he sat us down and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. And he explained how the database would work. And he said, there will be a point in the future where anyone will be able to take a DNA test and we will be able to tell them where they're from. Not just on the country level, not just on a state level even, but we'll be able to tell them, like, to a village where their family is from. And we're seeing that now. And it's incredible, that future view that he had about what this technology could bring.
Yeah. So here we are 2 decades later. Within a decade after that, other companies had launched, including Ancestry. Ancestry dipped our toes in the Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA space in the early days. Ancestry ended up purchasing the Sorensen database and then launched autosomal DNA testing in 2012. And from your perspective, like, how did autosomal DNA testing change the face of what was happening?
Oh, it was incredible. I mean, I remember, again, giving all of these presentations, and I remember my script well enough to know that we used to say all the time, yes, well, you are limited to only a direct maternal or direct paternal line, but there's still so much we can do. You just have to find the right person to test. We were always so trying to be so positive about it. But honestly, it was not great. It was not great because of its limitations, but also not great because of its inability to clearly define relationships. You could say, yes, we're related, but it was in such a huge time frame that you couldn't take a lot of action on it. Yeah, we could be sisters or we could be 20th cousins. And it was really hard to tell the difference. And so autosomal was so needed, and it was part of the vision at the beginning. It just took a long time to get there.
So now here we are, 2 decades, more than almost 3 decades after all of that stuff started really, gaining some steam. And Ancestry, at least, has more than 25 million people who've taken the autosomal DNA test. One of my favorite stories is from working on the television show Long Lost Family. I was training a new person to do the genetic genealogy with us. And I sat her down and I said, okay, here's how this works. And we're going to I'm going to show you one, and then we'll do one together, and then you can try it yourself. That's kind of how we do that. And I sit down, and the closest match is a second cousin. And I thought, okay, this will be a good case to work on, to really show her. And we had it solved in 22 minutes. And I remember thinking, well, that wasn't very effective as an educational tool.
No.
But it was so exciting to recognize that even by then, and this was several years ago, with the number of people in the database, we could start reconstructing those family relationships in a very real way. And so for you, in your experience, you have also had a personal connection to genetic genealogy. And I would love to hear that story.
Yeah, well, it's a great story. And it's a story that began before I realized it was beginning. So my parents are the most supportive cheerleading parents ever. I can't remember a time when I wasn't encouraged in whatever direction I wanted to go in. They were always my biggest cheerleaders. And I remember, all sorts of scrapes I got myself into, but they were right behind me. Yes, let's do that. So when I started this whole, traveling in college and collecting blood samples and things like that, my parents would come visit for Christmas or other holidays, and my mom would come in the lab with me and I drew her blood. I'm not a phlebotomist, but I drew her blood and we processed it in the lab. She extracted the DNA out of it. She wanted to do all the things. She was all in. And so again, she was just doing it for fun and to be a part of what I was a part of, but then her sample was part of the database. It just, took its place among all the other samples that we'd collected. And so it moved along with us. It moved along to relative genetics. It moved along to ancestry eventually when it was sold there. And so it was kind of already a part of things before we really took that initiative to become part of something, not even recognizing what it would become. When I first started working with the samples, I was doing just mitochondrial DNA testing. And so we had this procedure where we would try each sample for the top 5 most popular haplogroups. That's what they're called, these deep ancestral groups for mitochondrial DNA. And they're, H is one of the names of it. And like 50% of people were in H. So you start with H, you eliminate 50% of your samples, and you take the other 50%, you try them for J and K. And my mom wasn't any of them. I was like, okay, am I doing something wrong? Did I, so I would go back and double check my lab work. And it took me a long time to actually get her mitochondrial DNA type, which was a W.
That is super rare.
Right? Very rare. So this was, early days of the internet. And so I started Googling, where does haplogroup W come from? And the highest propensity was in Poland. And that was the very first spark of curiosity I had ever had about who my mom's biological family was. We had just never wondered. My mom didn't grow up wondering. She really was so loved and cherished in her adopted family. She was the only child of my grandparents because they could not have children. And she was worshiped. I mean, my grandma could not stop saying amazing things about my mom all the time. And so she just never, I don't think she ever wondered. And that's odd, I know, for adoptees, but I just think she was just so satisfied and happy. And her identity was with the people that she had grown up with. And so this was my first, who did she come from? And I think for her as well, it was the first wonder moment. And so then those moments just kept building as we continued on. And in 2007, when 23andMe started their autosomal DNA test, I was working in the industry. I needed samples. I needed data so that I could practice, so that I knew how to teach people. And so I asked my parents to test, and they were willing. And so they tested. And for the first time, we saw DNA cousins, which was, again, not something I was really prepared for, and neither was she. To see a list of people that shared your biological heritage was actually groundbreaking. Even though most of them were distant, it didn't matter to us. These were her first genetic relatives, and it was really shattering. Yeah. Yeah,
it's so interesting because I think there's people even today, 15, 20 years into this, who take a DNA test because they want to understand their ethnicity or what regions of the world they're from. And it doesn't occur to them that cousin matching part of the product exists, and that's going to show up, and that's going to connect them with people. And I think everybody does have some degree of emotional reaction to that.
I think so. And I think it's not just for adoptees,
no.
Right? It's for everyone, because you come into the test with a question, usually, it would be cool if I knew how much Italian I had or something. And then you see this list of people, and most of us don't know most of the names. And yet we understand they belong to us in some way that we haven't yet defined. And it's really powerful.
Yeah. And it's interesting because for some people, it's the puzzle of the thing, right? This giant list of matches. And how do I put this 50,000 piece puzzle together to figure out how it all works? For some people, it's really burning, important identity questions that they're trying to resolve. And for some people, I think it's just, kind of a curiosity. And sometimes that curiosity grows and sometimes it wanes. But in the case of your mom, as you saw that list of matches, that was meaningful for you. What was her reaction?
Yeah, she also was curious. And again, for the first time, I think really asking herself the question, do I want to know this? Do we want to go down this path? Is this something that is worth figuring out for us? And we talked about it. And mostly she was of the opinion, well, let's just keep going and see where it leads.
Yeah.
So our closest match at 23andMe was a second cousin. And so I reached out to him and asked him just basic, hey, who's your family kind of questions. And his response was very thoughtful, especially for as early on as this was. He said, well, I recognize that my connection to you may reveal information about my family and their life choices. And I really need to think about this. And I really appreciated that response from him, that he knew that, as you did, like the things that you're choosing to do with your DNA don't affect just you.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So as you're starting down this path and you're starting now to reach out to other family members of your mom's, were her parents still living at the time, or was there conversations that way that were had?
Yeah, so that was actually one of her big requirements, is that we didn't start doing anything until my grandmother had passed away. My grandfather passed long ago, but my grandmother was still alive. She lived to be 100.
Wow.
And my mom was very clear. We do not do anything while grandma is still alive. I don't want her to ever feel like I ever wanted a different life than I had. And so we literally sat on everything until my grandma passed.
Yeah.
But once she did, I think my mom felt more confident moving forward. And honestly, it was probably more just to support me, right? Because I needed to learn how to solve these kinds of mysteries so that I could help other people solve these mysteries. Right. And so it was very slow. It was piece by piece. It was here a little and there a little. And, as Ancestry offered their DNA test, I said, let's test here. As Family Tree DNA offered theirs, I said, let's test here. It was very slow, very methodical, very pick it up, put it down kind of research.
Okay. So after that first second cousin reach out and his thoughtful response, we love when they respond.
Yes.
Like, how long was it from that time till you started making real connections or real discoveries for her?
Right. So with the second cousin at 23andMe, he did finally decide to share with us and help us. And so he provided his family tree, which, again, a second cousin, they share great grandparents. So I knew my mom had 4 great grandparent couples. So one of his great grandparent couples should be one of my mom's great grandparent couples. And then it should be easy to figure out. You would think. But it turns out he's a part of a really large group of people from, they're German-speaking Russians, and they immigrated into North Dakota almost exclusively. And there's this huge, huge population of these individuals. And so when I started looking at his family tree, it was like, everyone's one of 10 or 11 or 12 kids. And I was immediately overwhelmed. Like, there's no way that we could figure out this kind of connection just with genealogy alone. We would need many more DNA matches. And we didn't have them at that time. And so again, that was a point where we were like, oh, this is cool. And even just knowing that little bit that my mom's family came from this very culturally rich population, we did lots of fun research together. Hey, look, they did this and just about the population in general. And honestly, that was enough for her to feel like, oh, that's an interesting place where I come from. That's an interesting legacy that I have. And that was enough. She didn't need to know the individual names of the people. It was enough to be identified with this population or culture.
Yeah, that connection, I think, is for me one of the most interesting things about watching people on their DNA journey, is this idea that, oh, I'm connected to this ethnic group or this ethno-religion or this like group of people that I knew nothing about prior, but somehow that's in me.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. So while you're going on this journey with your mom, parallel, not only are you increasing your genetic skills, but now you've introduced genealogy into it for yourself. And how confident were you in the genealogy skills were you gaining, or were you reaching out to genealogists for help at this point?
Well, mostly I was just focused on my business and on learning how to do the DNA part. And I I know now, looking back, that I was picking up a lot more genealogy as I went than I thought that I was. And I was becoming a lot more proficient than I thought that I was, because the two are so intertwined. You really can't do one without the other. And so I didn't realize how much I already knew and how much I was learning. But really, from that point where we found that first, second cousin, it laid low for a long time before we got another close match. And our next close match we found at Family Tree DNA. And I reached out to that person as well. And she was very responsive. And it turns out I found her also on Ancestry. So people were starting to test at multiple places. And so it was helpful to see people in more than one place. It was helpful to see people with family tree information in more than one place. And this woman became a huge part of the search for us. She was clearly related on the other side. So we had this man at 23andMe related on one side of the family, and this woman at Family Tree DNA and Ancestry related on a different side. And her side was all like Texas, Southwest kind of heritage, as opposed to these German-speaking Russians from North Dakota. So very different lines, very different cultures. And so that was exciting now to have this second piece. And she was very helpful. And it took us a long time to figure out how we were connected to her. But she was an excellent genealogist. And she had a lot of people on her family test, which was also really, really helpful. And so it turns out we thought she was a second cousin to us, but it turns out we are multiply related to her. And so she looked much closer than she actually turned out to be later. But that's a whole huge other long story.
Is there a short version of that story? Is it like, was she a double first cousin or?
So the short version is that we think that, and I still don't know who my mom's dad is. But we think that he was also adopted. And so we think that he is the product of a relationship between an older man and his wife's sister's daughter.
So, okay.
Okay. So not actually related, but it's his niece.
Raised as his niece, yeah.
Right. But not related to him. And so we think that my mom's dad is actually their child. And so then this woman is a descendant of this man and his wife. And so then she's related through both sides. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's lots of that. I say this often on the podcast, which is families are messy. All families are messy in their own way. And families have always been messy. That's nothing new. And nothing reveals that, I think, faster than DNA as you start getting into things. My mom discovered a half sibling through DNA testing that she didn't know she had. This particular half sibling was raised as my mom's first cousin. So my grandfather had an affair with his sister-in-law that produced a child. That entire generation is deceased, so we don't know if any of them even knew. But now I have a new aunt, and I adore her. And my mom has, reconnected with her dad's side of the family, and it was messy and hard to get through that. But once we got through it, there's been really beautiful things that have come from that, and you start to realize at a really core level that we're not responsible for other people's choices, but we are responsible for how we treat each other and move forward. And so watching my mom go through that experience really informed the way that I look at stories like this and try not to pass judgment because lots of things happen that are messy.
Absolutely. And I'm really grateful for the messy part, because it's hard to, especially as a teacher and instructor, to have a really fantastic story. And then everybody thinks, well, that's great for you, but mine didn't turn out that way. And the beautiful thing about my mom's family is that on the dad's side is very messy and we still have a lot of unknowns, but on the mom's side, it is beautiful and powerful. So my mom was visiting me in Florida, for Christmas, and I was working and she was sitting on the couch near my office chair. And I just pulled up Ancestry to look at some things, and I realized that my mom had a new, very close DNA match. And you have that moment where you know what you're looking at and you just can't believe it, and you're kind of blinking and refreshing the page. Is this what I think it is? And it looked to be a half sibling to my mom. And I look over at her on the couch. She's just reading. And I feel the weight of the moment Like we are so close now to relationships now. Like these aren't second cousins. These are very close people. And I look over at her and I said, Mom, it looks like you have a new DNA match. And she looks up from her book. Oh, really? I said, yeah, come here. And so we looked at as much information as could be found, and it wasn't much. So this match had only initials and had a very small tree. And so I asked her, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to reach out to this person and see if they respond? Do you want me to just try to look around and see what I can find? And she said, sure, let's contact him. And so I crafted this really nice email where I was trying to be really positive and just, I think what I said was, my mom's so fantastic, like you'll want to know her. But if you don't, it's okay. We just want to know, some answers. And then, I hit send. And then, for like the next 2 days, you're like, refresh, and no response.
That's the worst.
And so, my mom leaves and months go by and she would ask me occasionally, so have we heard anything? And I said, no, but a lot of people don't get their messages. They don't log into Ancestry. It's not that he's rejecting you. He probably hasn't even seen it. She goes, okay, And then a few months later, I was talking to my sister and she was like, Diane, I can't believe you did that. Like she's already gone through enough. She's an older sister, so she knows better,
Hey, I'm an older sister.
Well, anyway, I started to feel bad. And this was April now, and I was supposed to be teaching some young adults, actually some teenagers, about genealogy. And I wanted something fun, engaging to get them into it. And I thought, well, maybe I'll tell them part of this story. And so I started to look around a little bit, using that little tiny tree that he had, looking for information. And I ended up finding an obituary for someone on his tree. And the obituary listed out all the names of this woman's children. And the initials that I had matched one of the children in the list. And I thought, oh, I think I have his name. And not only do I have his name, but I have where he lived. And so I was like, okay, well, with a name and where he lives, and theoretically he's still alive, I could just use the white pages and I could call him up. And so I went to one of those shady people finding websites because I couldn't, the white pages wouldn't load.
Oh no.
Like this is like modern times, and it was like, would not load. And so I was like one of those shady websites, and I was like, I don't know, like, do these people steal your credit card? And my husband's like, we have like credit card protection. Just like put the credit card in there. If they steal it, fine. We need the phone number. Yeah. I was like, okay. So I did. I found the phone number of this person who I think is my mom's half sibling who's taken a DNA test. And I dialed the number. And it went to voicemail. And I just said, hi, I think we might be related. So I'm just interested in chatting with you about that. Here's my phone number. And he called back, like right away.
Wow.
And he said, oh, I'd love to meet new family. Who are you? I was like, well,
I might be your niece.
Did you recently take a DNA test? He said, yes, actually I did. And I said, okay. And I kind of explained to him a little bit. And he just sat there in silence for a second. He says, let me get my wife. Oh. And so his wife gets on the phone and we kind of repeat it again. And he says, well, I guess I want to talk to your mom. I was like, she would love that. And so then I connected the two of them and they chatted, and it was beautiful. And so that was in April, within a month, they had organized a massive family reunion. And I flew up to Washington State, and my mom and my dad drove over across the state to Spokane, and my sister came and my daughter came, and we met my mom's 3 half siblings and learned the story. It's really beautiful, actually. So her mother grew up in this large family in North Dakota and married a man and had 3 kids. And he became abusive, alcoholic, abusive. And she finally got brave enough to divorce him at the same time that her father passed away. And like in the same year. And so then she and her mom and her disabled sister and her 3 kids pick up from North Dakota, and they move to Washington State where her other sister is living. They move into this like 2 or 3 bedroom house with her sister, her sister's kids, her sister's son, like so many people in this house. And my grandmother's name is Catherine, and Catherine started working. She worked 2 jobs, and she just tried to live and support her family. And somewhere in there, she got pregnant. So my mom is the youngest of 4.
Wow.
And by the time we found them, Catherine had passed away, but her youngest brother was still alive, and we were able to meet with him and talk with him. And he's actually the one who paid for the time that my grandmother spent in this unwed mother's home in Seattle. She called him and she said, I need money. And he didn't ask any questions. And he said, I'll give you whatever you need. And he sent the money. And it was beautiful to connect with him, and their whole family is just amazing. They are just so loving, and they just encompassed us. And, leaving that family reunion on the way home, I was like, Mom, how are you feeling? And she said, I never felt empty before. She never felt like she was missing anything. But then having this peace restored to her, she was more full than she'd ever felt. It was amazing. I'd never seen her like this. It was so beautiful.
Wow, that's amazing. It's so interesting to me because I think sometimes we feel this urgency because time runs out, and the fact that Catherine had already passed. But I also think things happen in exactly the way that they should. And so to know that she had these siblings that were so willing to embrace her. Did they remember their mom being pregnant?
No, they don't. But, the oldest was a girl, but she was 8. And then the boys were boys.
Yeah. And little.
And little. Yeah.
Yeah. Has she been able to maintain a relationship with them?
Yeah, she did up until she passed. And it was a wonderful strength for her to have these brothers. They came to her dying bedside, held her hand just like brothers would. Yeah. And they were incredible people, and they have been wonderful to me and my sister and my dad ever since. And it has been a true restoration, in our lives.
I love that. So you went from, working with Dr. Woodward, trying to identify bodies in a cemetery in Cairo, to this really personal connection for your mom, where you were able to identify exactly who her people were. And the arc of that is a really beautiful journey for you. And now, of course, you have a full business that does this. So if people want to learn more about genetic genealogy or take advantage of the tools that you have available, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, they can come to our website. It's yourdnaguide.com. And we're just all about helping you discover your own story. So we don't want to do it for you, because I think that takes away that moment of discovery that is so powerful, that connects you to yourself and to your people in a way that can't be had in any other form. And so we're really about providing the tools so that you can do this yourself.
Yeah. Thank you. And it's not just for adoptees, right? I think sometimes people get it stuck in their head, like, I already know my family, so why would I want to take a DNA test? What would you say to that?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, we don't know what we don't know. And DNA is very powerful, and it can help you find your 3 times great grandmother. And most of us don't know all of those. And so connecting even to more distant ancestors can be a really powerful way to see yourself and to understand your own story, to understand their trials and their triumphs. It is passed down to us, all of those things. And it is in the fabric of who you are. And if you don't know it, you can't exploit it in the best way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I think for me, another side of that coin is I may know exactly who all 16 of my great-great-grandparents are, but I may be the key to somebody else's discovery. And so I think there's things I can discover about myself always, but then there's also, we hold pieces of each other as well.
I love that. It's beautiful. We do.
Having shared this story and reflecting on your journey into genetic genealogy, what is it that you hope for the future?
I think my biggest hope for the future is that the next generation will take up this cause, that they will see the importance of this work to before it's too late. I think naturally people age into genealogy because as we get older, we do tend to think about legacy and we think about our families more. But I feel like it has to start sooner. It has got to start sooner. These young adults, especially these teenagers, they need the foundation that family history provides. And we can't wait for them to get to retirement before they discover the power of it. And so my hope is that we as an industry can figure out how to reach people younger and get them involved in a way that will impact them positively for so much more of their life than just the end.
Beautifully said. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I always love talking to you.
Yes, this is fabulous. Thank you.